Hello and welcome to the program. Now, true to his promise to maintain the January to December budget cycle, President Muhammadu Buhari has presented the 2021 budget estimate to the National Assembly for consideration and approval. Tagged Budget of Economic Recovery and Resilience, the appropriation bill has an estimated expenditure of 13.08 trillion naira and a revenue projection of 8.433 trillion naira, leaving a deficit of 5.2 trillion naira, which will be financed mainly by new borrowings, 4.28 trillion of which has already been approved by the Senate. Now, this deficit will represent 3.64% of the GDP, which is, of course, higher than the 3% recommended by the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Again, the new borrowing figure also represents about a third of the proposed 2021 budget. Other highlights of the budget include oil price benchmark now of $40 per barrel, crude production of 1.86 million barrels per day, and that, of course, includes condensate, exchange rate of 379 naira to a dollar, GDP growth rate of 3%, and inflation rate pegged at 11.9%. Current inflation rate, by the way, is way up at 13.22%. Now, in recent past, there's been a lot of controversy over the country's debt profile, but the government hopes to boost internal revenue generation to further provide funding support in implementing some of its projects for the coming year. Joining me now to discuss this and more is Eze Onyekpere, who is the Executive Director, Center for Social Justice. He joins us via Skype from Abuja. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. First off, you want to give kudos to the government that it's able to achieve, because that's what we're beginning to see. And if you go by what the National Assembly has promised, that the budget would be passed before the end of the year. So the government is now effectively going back to the January to December budget cycle. And so it deserves commendation for that, right?
Well, that's where it ends, because it's not just enough to pass the budget early, but really? What do you do with implementation? Yes, that's a good one. And also the fact that the government is going to put up a tax expenditure statement, which is also required by the Fiscal Responsibility Act and which has been ignored in the previous years. So it's a good development anyway.
Let's talk about the revenue. The government hopes to raise 8.433 trillion naira. Of course, it's the shortfall 5.2. But the fact is that you look at what the country is currently going through, and you look at the fact that the effects of the COVID-19 are still very much here with us. We do not know if the country will be able to make a full recovery before the beginning of next year. You think this revenue target can actually be achieved?
I think the revenue target is overtly optimistic, drawing from the experience of 2020. As we speak today, the president told us yesterday that it was only 2.10 trillion that they've been able to raise for the first 7 months of 2020. Now, if you prorate that to the end of the year, you will discover that we may not raise more than 4 trillion, or roughly about 4.2 or 4.3 trillion at the end of the year. So if that is the actual for the year, and why are we going to start projecting it almost double that figure for 2021? And also considering the fact that by the time the Bureau of Statistics brings out the results, the GDP result for this quarter, for the last quarter, we are likely entering into a recession. So where will this money come from? Because if you looked at the budget as well, they were predicting projecting they will get about 2.1 trillion from oil revenue and another 1.54 something from non-oil, which is about 3.5. So the bulk of even what they say they are going to raise, nobody is sure where it's going to come from before you begin to talk about new borrowing and the other part of the deficit. So I think it is overtly optimistic, and that is where the budget failure starts from. When you begin to project for more revenue than you will actually get.
And I can't but agree more with you because, I mean, you look at it, trade has actually not recovered. It's still been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. You look at what is happening across the world now. Europe is basically having a second wave of the COVID-19 and they're beginning to shut down as well. So the question is, what are we looking at, even in terms of customs and what have you? I'm just quite pessimistic that we'll be able to raise much from customs and other trade activities. So it's difficult to see how we're going to raise the money. But do you think the government could be seeing something that we're not seeing?
Well, this thing that they are seeing now that we don't see is what has been happening all over the years, and we've always had a shortfall. So I don't think that there's any crystal ball which is available to them and which is not available to all of us. Because if you even look at the Nigeria External Trade Report for the second quarter, we imported about 4 trillion naira worth of goods and only exported about 2.2 trillion worth of goods and services. So we had a negative trade balance of 1.8 trillion. So the currency is depreciating by the day. We are importing more than we are exporting. And of course, the inflation rate are pegging at 11.9 or there, 5.9 or thereabout. Today, we are doing 13.2, and that is the figures for August. And these figures for August did not take cognizance of the push that is now being occasioned by the increase in electricity tariff and the increase in fuel price, because it had not been done by August when this 13.2. So I believe that by now, by the time we get that of September, we could be talking about say 15%. Percent. So I don't see some of these figures as being realistic. Even the one they did $40 per barrel, well, that's realistic. And then the 1.86 million barrels a day, that's also realistic. But there is a lack of transparency in failing to tell Nigerians about the excess oil which they produce, which is the oil that they give to international oil companies to pay for the backlog and the present joint venture cash calls. They've been giving them some excess oil so that we don't continue owing, so that they can sell and make their money, and Nigeria will have paid for these joint venture cash calls. That's not reflected in the budget. And even if you look at the way the budget is structured, you have recurring non-debts taken up to 40-something percent, 43, 44% of the budget. Then you have the debt, you have the statutory transfers. What I'm trying to say is the reality of how the budget works. So by the time they pay salaries and pay debts and then transfer statutory transfers, whatever is remaining is what will go to capital. And that's why the capital implementation suffers year after year. And now the revenue is short, definitely capital budget implementation will also suffer.
I have to ask you this. Why is it so difficult to, be realistic in our budgeting? Why not budget on the basis of what we actually have? Is it something difficult to do? Is there a science to it? Or is it not realistic to do, to do a budget that is more realistic and basically looking at what you have and then you budget around it?
Our previous interactions with the Budget Office and Ministry of Finance indicated that the bulk of the money that doesn't come is always with the money they're expecting from MDAs, the 25% of their revenue which they should transfer and all those IGR. But the question is, they say that by their calculation, which is realistic, that these agencies can deliver the money, but somehow it never gets to come. And all kinds of challenges arise, especially if you also look at an NPC that withholds money that is due to the Federation account. I mean, between 2014 and 2017, an NPC withheld over 4.45 trillion, and they're not saying anything about paying it. And that's why I'm talking about these joint venture cash calls. The funding should be transparently stated in the budget so that we know what to expect and what not to expect, so that an NPC wouldn't withhold money and start telling their usual stories and nothing will come out of it. So I think what operates on the mind of the president and his minders is, if we do a small budget of 5 or 6 trillion, people will start laughing at us. It will look so small. By the time you share it per capita, they will say you are budgeting 5 or 10,000 per capita. But that's the truth. So I perfectly agree with you that we should simply cut our coats according to the size of our clothes and according to our size. And if you ask me, I would say that we should place a moratorium on new borrowing because we have not closed all the loopholes where we're having leakages. And there's nothing that says that you cannot do infrastructure without sovereign debts. There are all kinds of public-private PPP arrangements, okay, that could be done that will get special purpose vehicles that will attract investors that will even get Nigerians to invest in their own infrastructure so that we cut down this debt. And the debt we are talking about is about $85.9 billion, okay, the national debt. And that's one side of the picture. We are not even looking at how much the federal government owes the central bank, which they collect through ways and means of whether they are doing seniorage. 11 trillion, okay, is what the federal government is owing the central bank. This is just money somehow the central bank creates for them to fund the budget. We're discussing inflation, we're discussing all kinds of things. By the time you factor it in, you discover that Nigeria is owing in excess of $100 billion. And how are we going to pay back? If our revenue is depreciating, if our ability to make foreign exchange is depreciating, how do we pay back? So that's why I'm saying we need to get a moratorium on fresh borrowing, particularly the foreign component of the borrowing, so that we don't become a basket case, we will not be, because it may come a time we will no longer be able to pay. And that's what's happening. We are putting aside 3-point-something trillion for debt servicing.
So debt servicing, yes. And I was just going to ask you that, because that must be quite worrying. I mean, you know, that's about a third of the budget anyway.
No, not just a third of the budget. That is about what we are likely to get. It will be about 3/4 of the actual revenue that comes in. Because let me give you the scenario. In the first half of 2020, we made 1.81 trillion. 1.81 trillion, that's all that came to the federal government. Out of it, we used 1.61 trillion to pay salaries and pensions. So when we finished paying salaries, we had only $200 billion left. And we now went ahead to pay 1.57 trillion on debt service. So the implication is that we couldn't have paid that 1.57 trillion if we didn't borrow 1.35 trillion to augment the 200. Okay, so we borrowed about 1.3 trillion to put to the 200 that was remaining and then service debt. So where did we get the money to do overheads? Where did we get the money for capital? Where did we get money for statutory transfers? So we are borrowing to service already matured debts. Again, the scenario, we are currently borrowing to pay back what we have taken before. So why continue borrowing? Why don't you tell Nigerians the truth that our country is broke? If Nigeria was a private sector concern, the creditors would have applied for it to be wound up.
Probably would have filed for bankruptcy.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. So tell Nigerians the truth. Let's know how bad the situation is, and let's put us together and see how we can go forward, rather than borrowing to pay salaries, rather than borrowing to service already existing debts. It's not sustainable. By the time you do it in the next 2-3 years, this whole place will come crashing on our heads. That's the unfortunate scenario, but that's the truth.
All right. Eze, thank you very much for your insights there, and thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
All right, we'll take a short break now, and we'll be right back. On DEJI360, we don't just ask the questions. What is wrong with amending the Constitution the way the National Assembly members have been doing it? We seek answers.
Constitution is constituent. Our problem is not lack of laws. Our problem is lack of the willpower to implement our laws.
Answers that provide clarity.
While we negotiate, we should try to make it a point that the girls must be complete.
The clarity you need to make informed judgment so that you can make the right decision and take action. People are saying it is you politicians that are responsible for this, that you are the reason why this is happening.
All these dollars that call themselves governors in this country. I wish we had people like Tony at the National Assembly. God forbid that I go to join that
DEJI360, providing clarity to issues.